Welcome to the Field Dynamics podcast. We're here to facilitate inspiring dialogues about the nature of consciousness across disciplines, communities, and practitioners, all with a holistic perspective.
From energy healing to somatic therapies, from neuroscience to meditation, we believe the most interesting things happen at the boundaries of disciplines.
I'm Christabel.
And I'm Keith.
Thanks for joining us today and enjoy the episode. Welcome to this episode of the Field Dynamics podcast. Today we have here with us Laurie Keene. Laurie Keene is an author, international teacher, and speaker of spirituality, personal transformation, and the evolution of human consciousness. She has spent 3 decades as a leader in the mindfulness movement. Laurie is a Brennan Healing Science Practitioner and teacher, a living practice mentor, core energetic therapist, and Continuum teacher. Working side by side with Barbara Brennan for over 25 years, she was Dean of the Barbara Brennan School of Healing from 1993 to 2016. She now offers her expertise as a board member and senior faculty at the school. Laurie's teachings are grounded in deep compassion for the human condition, arising from her own very human life and direct experiences of awakening. Her presence, humor, and insight help to soften the habitual defenses of the ego and invite loving contact with the truth of who we are. She has taught throughout the United States and Europe, as well as Canada, Mexico, Israel, and Japan. Laurie is author of Awakening to the Truth of Who You Are and is currently at work on her second book, The Multidimensional Self. Firstly, Laurie, welcome. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here with us today.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.
We wondered if you would like to share a little of your experience in terms of what brought you to explore healing work initially. And I guess I'm asking here particularly about the life-threatening illness you experienced in your 20s and how this set you on a journey of exploration.
Okay, thanks, Christabel. Yeah, it's interesting to me, having now taught for so many years, how many of us are actually propelled onto the path, the search from some traumatic or life-changing event. And certainly for me, that happened in my 20s. And I spent 4 years in and out of hospitals, multiple surgeries. And after the last one, there was just this deep sense of loss and a lack of really understanding why I was here. You know, dark night of the soul, shall I say. And again, many of us have experienced that. And it was actually that really got me started in my search. I started meditating. I went to therapy. And then from there, I quit my corporate job and put a backpack on and decided I was going to go off and travel the world until I really felt like I had deeply healed and found myself. And I spent a lot of time in Europe, in the Middle East, and I fell in love with the deserts and would just hike through the deserts and camp and would spend hours really sitting in deep meditation. And I'll never forget the moment from kind of all that being lost and confused. And I was standing on the shore of the Aegean, and I kind of looked out and just said, I can go anywhere in the world and do anything I want to do because I had myself. And then that was the turning point. I came home. I actually had become a chef overseas. That was kind of my first, I guess, passion. I'm a big believer in teaching people to take the risks, discover their passion, because once you've got your passion, you've got a sense of purpose. And then it's up to you to pursue that. And that's deeply connected into the energetic work. So I came home, studied with the White House pastry chef, became a classically trained chef in French cooking, and Yeah, started cooking. And it was interesting because one of my earlier teachers, Rosalind Bruyere, who was one of Barbara's teachers, I don't know if you're familiar with her, Reverend Rosalind Bruyere. She's the founder of the Healing Light Center out of Glendale, California. And she's also an author. She wrote Wheels of Light. And I would cook for Rosalind when I was studying with her, and she would always say, somebody's got to put the light in the food. And that was definitely what I loved doing. Still love doing that, actually. And then in 1986, you learn that the path isn't always just a nice, beautiful, even uphill or a parallel road, but you go up and down. And I hit another very difficult period of my life, and that was through a marriage where I discovered alcoholism. My husband, my ex-husband, was an alcoholic, and then again, that kind of even more firmly catapulted me into my search. And I met Barbara at that time in 1986, and then my life just took another turn. And I studied healing with Barbara. I actually never thought I was going to be a healer. I wasn't really interested in it at the beginning. I just really wanted everything I could have to be a completely healed human being. However, spirit, as spirit does, kept giving me what I tell students, spiritual carrots along the way, things that I disbelieved. And I have an example of that. And I tell my students this because when I first did my first workshop with Barbara, she would do a lot of energy exchange practices. And it seemed like everybody in the room was getting something but me. And I was hearing people calling out, oh, I see angels. Oh, there's this beautiful purple light. And I was, using my hand and I got nothing. And at that point in time, I thought people must be making this stuff up. But on the last day of that workshop, I had my hands on somebody. We were doing a chelation, which perhaps you're familiar with that healing technique. And that was created by Rosalind, by the way, and given to Barbara to bring into the school. And I had my hands on this guy. And all of a sudden, this X-ray of his spine popped out in front of me. And I looked at it, and his spine was crooked. And I just went, what's that? And then it dissolved. But it literally had appeared that it was a fourth dimensional phenomena, astral, well, fourth level in the fourth dimension, because from my experience, that's where the field exists, appeared in the third dimension. And after the healing, I told the guy I was working on, he said, Laurie, let me show you. And he lifted up his shirt. He said, I have scoliosis and I've had many surgeries. And I didn't see anything else for another 6 months, but that was spirit going, okay, you know how horses love carrots or sugar cubes, like follow, keep doing the work. And I did. It's my life, it's my life's work. And I always say, and you can probably resonate with this as teachers yourself, for me, when somebody gets another part of themselves, that's the gold. That's why I do what I do. Because being healed in myself, waking up happy, full, excited, I know what it's like to be in pain. I know what it's like to be lost. And I understand the deep homecoming when we come home to ourselves. So that's a little tiny slice of how I came into the energy work.
Thank you, Laurie. You said coming home to yourself. Maybe that has something to do with the word awakening. And in your book, Awakening to the Truth of Who You Are, you share details of your personal awakening process. So I was wondering if you might describe this a bit to our listeners about awakening or awakening process from whatever angle you'd like to.
Yeah, so what I write about in my book is, and it's just from my journey and my experiences, I've kind of laid down some principles that I feel are maybe useful to people who are searching. And the first thing is I write about what I call the 5 obstacles that stand between us and the truth of who we are. And then I write about the 7 phases of human consciousness that from my experience we journey through in that process of awakening. And awakening you could call enlightenment. I call it illuminated, because from my experience of having been awakened, and I'm not constantly awakened, okay? I think very few people are. It's everything changes. So I'll give you the kind of big example in my life about that. And I think also sometimes I think this is kind of a paradox that sometimes we wake up in our deepest despair. Certainly Eckhart Tolle writes about that. Byron Katie shares about that. I've studied with her. Sri Ramana Maharshi, I don't know if you're familiar with him. I love his writings and work. He woke up when he was terrified of death and asked, well, who is the I who's terrified of death? Well, for me, it was in 1985, before I'd met Barbara. And again, I was kind of in this despair, which is really when we're in such separation from ourselves, where we have the self-hatred, the self-judgment, again, that sense of like, why are we even here? And I was in that place going through this very difficult separation and divorce out of, what was a very difficult experience. Though I have to say, spirit directly led me in to that relationship and marriage. I have no regrets. I was absolutely guided by spirit to go into that relationship, and I'm forever grateful to my ex-husband for everything that he helped me to learn. But anyways, I went to a one-day workshop, and it was called The Power of the Mind. And a lot of my spiritual practice has been kirtan, chanting. I love chanting. And we were chanting Om Namah Shivaya, which means I bow to the self, to the God within. And I was in absolute torment as I was chanting this and judging myself. How could I have done all that work, which, really was about 5 years. It seems like a lifetime, right? When students go, I've been doing this for 4 years. I'm like, oh, you're just getting started, because I've been doing this for over 40 years now, about 40 years. And I kept chanting Om Namah Shivaya, Om Namah Shivaya, as I was in such despair. And then literally from one moment to the next, I went from despair to being completely awakened. And when that occurred, you really get that this is a dream. It's a very powerful dream. This third dimension is a dream. And I could literally see for hundreds of thousands of miles. I could see across this planet, across the universes. Everywhere I looked, all I saw was light and felt love. And in that moment, like your ego ceases to exist. Your wound, all the traumas, and they're gone. Because, in some way, and this is from my perspective in terms of the multidimensional self, we fabricate these for our incarnational purpose that is embedded in this kind of greater field of awareness and our movement as a species on this planet in terms of evolving. Sometimes it doesn't look like that or feel like that, but I do believe that essentially that's what's happening. And it lasted for a week. And everywhere I went, I was able to function, but everywhere I went and everyone I saw, I just felt and saw light emanating from them. And I remember seeing a couple, and it looked like if I was in my separated self, it would have looked like they were arguing. And when I looked at them, I was like, oh my God, they're expressing love. They're just confused. They're trying to find their way to each other. And they're just lost. They're confused. So I do write about when you are awakened, it's like it's perceived as light, expressed as love, and experienced as joy and peace. But here's the other thing I'll say to that, and this might be helpful to the people who listen in. What I've also come to understand, that spirit in its infinite wisdom doesn't always keep us awakened. We are being tempered. You know how like a fine wine is like it takes years to age, that I think we go back and forth, because a week later I kind of popped back down and I was all of a sudden back in the third dimension. I felt a little fear. It was a life-changing event. I can still touch into that experience, and I've had many since then. But I think spirit takes us back and forth across the threshold of awakening, completely remembering who we are, that we are all that is. As Alan Watts said, we are the aperture through which the universe is perceiving itself. When you're awake, that's what you are. You are, you realize you are everything. You're pure consciousness. Then we go back into forgetting, but that back and forth creates a resiliency in us. It helps us to open and to be in, I want to say, a sustainable relationship with what is arising in the emerging consciousness. And my experience is that awakening occurs through grace, because you never know when it's going to happen. And grace visits us and gives us a beautiful taste of, what I call actually the reality of consciousness.
Thank you, Laurie. It's really nice to feel into energetically what you're sharing there. Very, very powerful. You've mentioned the astral. You've mentioned this idea of the multidimensional self. Here at Field Dynamics, I guess I have our own way of languaging or talking about that structure. I'd love to hear from your perspective. You've studied, so many different modalities, including the Brennan school, as we referenced in the bio. From your perspective, what the model of the human multidimensional system or anatomy is, how you perceive that or how you experience it.
Yeah, it's interesting. So if we think about dimensions, and there's so much great information about that, if you think about, so the second dimension, okay, and I think there's, was it Carl Sagan who wrote about like a second dimensional being trying to experience the third dimension. Are you familiar with this? How that's really an impossibility, because they're called flatlanders. So you're a piece of paper, and third dimension is depth. So if you're a flat piece of paper, you can't experience the third dimension because it's not in your awareness. So in our work, we're entering the field. The fourth dimension is time. Okay, which is why Barbara wrote about it. I totally agree that the field is the fourth dimension. In the fourth dimension, we can go forwards and backwards. We can go into past lives. We can go into future lives. We're not bound by time and space as a third dimensional being. Now, a lot of people to have this conversation with, like me in that first weekend with Barbara, a very third dimensional being, though I had actually had some pretty expanded experiences prior to being with Barbara, but never with running energy, that would seem almost impossible. Well, what do you mean you can work long distance and transmit energy? Because as a third dimensional being, you can't grok it because you haven't connected in or grown in, let's say, into that other dimension. So then from there, okay, now we're I'm sure you're fourth dimensional beings as well, right? We're third and fourth. I live it every day. It's part of my life experience. Then we have all these other dimensions. I think physics is saying 11, 12, 13. So the fifth dimension is a place, and in my work, I have a body of work that I call Following the Soul. And actually, even considering field dynamics, core energetics, we kind of look at the different characterological defense systems and get a sense of what their fields are like based on their trauma and wound. However, for me, it's a lot more complex and unique than that, because when you're working with an individual, they have a lot more going on than just a fixed characterological defense system. Once you've developed the ability to perceive, using in Brennan Healing Science language, high sense perception, classically you would call it clairaudience, clairvoyance, clairsentience. When you have that ability, that's then opening you up to these other dimensions that exist within us and all around us. So from my experience as a multidimensional person, and this is one of the things I'm writing about, because kind of the long title of that book is The Multidimensional Self, Restoring the Relationship Between the Personality and the Soul, a New Paradigm of Consciousness for Humanity. So the field is the dimension of the personality. Okay. Typically, as humans, we've kind of separated our spiritual selves from our human personality selves. What I see as this edge of consciousness that we are on or in is the bringing together of those. Where do they meet? So I see the soul is often on the fifth dimension or beyond, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th. And the intersection is the field. So in working with someone, I always say, look, the soul is always revealing itself. I can look at your field and see whether you're aware of it or not. Your soul is evoking some form of consciousness through your field, and it's changing every moment. So in my work with people, in terms of becoming a more expanded multidimensional self, it's really slowing it down, being with them moment to moment, as really the soul is bringing a self-recognition that the human self is longing for, though may have blocked, but it's always shining through. So to shift from dimension to dimension, since they're all kind of curled in on each other, is just you get from one to the other by shifting your frequency. And that shift of frequency perspective brings you on into another dimension. And once you've really developed that ability, it's very fast. It just literally happens. Somebody will say, "Oh, would you look?" And I'll set my intention, and then I'm there.
So we do a lot of teaching people to sense the field, and you're talking about sensing it. You mentioned HSP, high sense perception, a term from Barbara's work. What is it that you do in teaching people now that you're working through your own approach with people? How are you teaching them to sense this as you've been describing it? And also, what's your way, let's say, of sensing it? Because we know that it can reveal itself, or that each person is unique in the way in which they feel or sense the world, and they have to discover that for themselves. So what's a methodology or an approach you have?
Yeah. So first of all, I think the school has a really great model for developing high sense perception. And it starts out very basically in the first year. So one of the things that we teach in terms of HSP is that you perceive through your chakras. So the first chakra is kinesthetic. Okay, that's the felt sense. Second chakra is emotions. Third chakra is intuition, though we use the word intuition in the school differently than a lot of modalities do, because a lot of modalities say you're an intuitive. They kind of bring, that's the umbrella for perceiving. We say third chakra is a vague sense of knowing. Like you think about somebody, you haven't thought about them for a long time, and they call you the next day. Oh, that was your third chakra active. Fourth chakra is love. Fifth chakra is hearing, taste, and smell. Sixth chakra is sight, and seventh chakra is direct knowing. So those are the senses. And then what we do in the first year is we start listening, and we encourage students to listen to their languaging, because the way you speak actually gives you a clue in terms of what sense you're using that you may not even be aware of. Like when you say, oh, I really hear what you're talking about, or yeah, I see what you're saying. So that's kind of an inkling. And then, I mean, we do a lot of different practices. By the time they're in the third year, so I teach in the third year in Florida and advanced studies in the UK, we're starting to encourage students to really work at exploring one's ability to perceive the field with at least two senses. Okay. Now, yeah, I teach a lot about HSP. So one of the things, and I have 9 principles that I've created around HSP, which I'm happy to share with you at some point in time. I think that would be a whole other conversation. But what I think is important to understand, that high sense perception, I think fundamentally is a tool to grow ourselves relationally. And I think sometimes HSP has been thought of as a tool just to gather information. But for me, that could be used as a defense rather than as a way to enrich ourselves in relationship to each other. That's the first thing. The second, I guess I'm giving you a few of the principles, but I can't remember them quite in order. The other thing is, I always say, look, you're not looking for what's wrong, you're looking for what is. Because, you know, as humans, we're pretty hardwired to kind of look for what's wrong. And I go, let's just open ourselves up to looking for what is, you know? And so just want to pause and feel into that for a moment. So in terms of my senses, I would say my first sense, unbeknownst to me, but through spirit, was hearing. And here's another thing I teach about: sight and hearing to me are different than the other senses, in that, and maybe the first is the same, kinesthetic. I haven't really thought about that before, but I say that we have voluntary and involuntary sight and hearing. So involuntary is when, like that X-ray of the guy's spine, right? That was totally involuntary. And it appeared within the third dimension. Okay. I've also had the gold Paramattanan light appear involuntarily. I can see it all through the room. That's different than typical sight, which I'm seeing on my mind screen. That's voluntary. I do that all day long. Same thing with hearing. Okay. I hear all day long, but I've had a lot of involuntary hearing that has been in the third dimension. And my very first experience of this, and this was when I was traveling on my quest, my heroine's journey, was I was living on an island in Greece, And I had just come home from work, and an altercation had happened, not between me, but I was present for it. And I got back to my house that I was renting, and a voice said, "Get up, pack your bags, and leave now." And I was kind of like looking around, like, who's saying that? And the voice, it was very strict. "Get up, pack your bags, and leave now." At first, I thought I was crazy. Then I started arguing with the voice, and this went on through the night. And I was like, I can't leave. I've got friends coming from the US. I've got this job, blah, blah, blah. Get up, pack your bags, and leave now. And when dawn came, I said, okay, you win. I'll go. And the voice stopped. Now, that voice has come to me about 8 different times in my life, and it's always been very life-changing. I did follow that voice, and unfortunately, a week later, had I stayed, there was a terrible car accident, and many of my friends were killed, and I would have been with them. So that was involuntary hearing. Working with students in my work of following the soul, I'll stand next to, say, 2 of them, and I'll have one, say, be the healer, and one be the client, okay? And just really invite them to start tracking moment to moment, because everything they say, every eye movement, every gesture has an effect in both directions. It's a relational field. While the soul is emerging as it is expressing itself through the field. And really, it takes practice, like anything, right? And it takes surrender. It takes opening and letting go. When I started with Barbara, I had that X-ray, and then I didn't see anything for 6 months. My 6th chakra really did not open until the 3rd year. And I remember we were sitting, and back in those days, it was upstairs in her house. There were like 10 of us in class. And we were reading one guy, his name was John, and all of a sudden my sight opened, and it's just been open ever since. So here's the other thing I teach people about high sense perception. It is a natural part of who we are. As you grow, as you heal, as you develop, you're going to be able to perceive, because it's like smelling and seeing and touching and hearing in the physical world, in the field, in the 4th dimension. It's just a natural part of who you are. The second thing is, and I think in the kind of brilliance of the modality and how it's been laid out over the course of 4 years, it's like, oh, you want to see? Everybody wants to see. Well, guess what? You've got to open that chakra. And you don't just have to open that chakra, you have to have enough energy generating through that chakra to be able to perceive. We've all closed. Typically, when people come onto the path, I always say, look, you're living from some chakras, you're not living from others. You're living from some levels of the field, and you're not living from others. That's imbalanced homeostasis. You have blocked part of your life experience based on traumas, wounds, images, limited belief systems. As you heal those, your chakras open. As your chakras open, your ability to perceive increases, certainly, and develops. So I think it's a really beautiful, organic way to develop ourselves as a multidimensional being, and to be able to perceive. And then the other thing just about perceiving and seeing is, and I teach my students this, I say, look, when let's say I was going to read Christabel, okay, I would look at you directly, okay, but I would also look away and look at you, because the field, I can put the field anywhere and look at it, because it's not bound by by time and space as we are in the third dimension. So I'll look at you, but also sometimes I can see more clearly when I'm looking away. So I do it back and forth. And then the other thing I do when I'm teaching my students is you also want to use your ability to perceive as both a microscope and a telescope. So you want to be able to go in to the cells, deep into the cells and look, and you want to be able to expand out and look at the broader expanse of what's here in terms of one's consciousness. So if somebody calls me and says, hey, I've got this great job offer in Denver, and I live in Delaware. Should I take that job? I'll take a look at that from a lot of different vantage points, from their soul's incarnational purpose, from the benefits, the pluses and minuses of what's going on in them based on what their future decision might be, because it's all here, right? All time is happening right now. I'll do that with a lot of things. I'll say, somebody's looking really depleted. I'll say, well, let's put some spinach in your field and let's see how your field reacts to that spinach, because your field's going to react and it's all visible. Oh, wow, your field really likes spinach. Well, let's see how much spinach your field likes, So you're like playing around with things. And we do, we do things like, at least we used to do when I taught in the first year, like really experimenting with feeling into different colored pieces of paper, having groups sit in the room, radiating an emotion, and having some of the students be out of the room and then coming into the room and seeing if they can pick up what emotion. So a lot of different practices you can do to develop it, but just to deeply understand that your ability to perceive is hopefully in alignment with you getting more and more of yourselves, awakening.
Thank you, Laurie. I particularly enjoyed that principle of HSP as a tool to grow ourselves emotionally. And I know that we could talk about the HSP forever. Keith and I are very passionate about that subject. I want to move things on slightly away from how we see to what we're seeing and sensing, right? The blocked energy patterns, the distortions in the field. We mentioned in your bio, you're also a core energetics teacher. Body is central to core energetics, and many techniques are being used to work with the body to address these blocked energy patterns, right, that we're perceiving with the HSP. Underlying this is a belief that emotions are not just psychological, but they're also stored physically in the body. This is very much in alignment with our approach here at Field Dynamics. Could you talk us through a little of the experience of the client in body energetics, in core energetics, apologies? What's the session look like? What might a client be bringing to the table?
Yeah, so first of all, let me just clarify, I'm not a core energetics teacher. I have been invited to teach master classes at core energetics. I am a core energetic practitioner. John Parakis, the founder of core energetics, was my therapist for 3 years. Studied back in the 90s. And yeah, wow, talk about energy as physical blocks. Yes, I certainly learned a lot about that. So I would say at this point in my work, I'm probably not the best person to talk about kind of the classical core energetic approach, because while I do use some of it now, my work is also kind of morphed into my own work. So here's what I can say about that. Yes, everything that's in the field is in the body. Everything is energy and consciousness. And I guess for me, the work has just become more subtle. I went 10 weeks a year to Manhattan, 10 weekends a year for 4 years to study core energetics. And a lot of it, and again, working with John as my therapist, I remember my very first session with him. which basically he had me on a roller just on my lower back. And I was just kind of rolling forwards and backwards and breathing. He had me doing this deep breathing, and I released such a block in my third chakra. I spent the next 2 hours bent over his toilet. And boy, he was so wonderful. He put his bathrobe on me and he stayed with me for 2 hours as I wasn't vomiting on the physical level. I was vomiting energetically. Literally, just so much was coming out of me. So that was stored, blocked energy in my third chakra. Things as simple as rolling on well, they kind of look like this, okay, that they use in core energetics, though they're hard. I mean, there are definite tools used in core energetics. There's the cube, where you've got, here's the main thing, I guess, that I think is important. And it was certainly my big takeaway from core, because I've done a lot of Bataka work, and I've done a lot of Bataka work with students and clients in the past, is the idea of doing these exercises is what you want to do is you want to increase the energy on the block to the point where it breaks through the block, and then the inconvenient emotions can be experienced and released. And that's what's held in the body, are all of the when we've all experienced multiple traumas and wounds, and at these very young ages, typically in utero and up through 5 years of age, though I do also see that those can be repeated in puberty. Okay, so not just the classical approach, but also in puberty, those traumas and wounds can be experienced at that time. But let's just say, as a young child, this young organism has an experience that can't be metabolized and can't be processed. And so a split is formed. And part of the self, with all of those feelings, is held in that split. And then we begin to manage our energy systems to survive, to grow, and to live. But those parts are still held within the body. And in core energetics, what happens then, it actually shows up in the body. And in the first year, I would teach body reading to the students. You can see somebody who's had a classic, let's say, and I'm using core terms here, the schizoid trauma and wounding, which is the earliest wounding. Okay, and that is the baby comes in and experiences a hostile environment, or can experience aggression, or a cold presence of the caregiver, mother, father, caregiver, and goes, I'm out of here, and literally twists up and out and splits. That is visible in the body. So you can look at somebody, there's typically a twist, sometimes there's scoliosis in the spine, they're lopsided. Okay, I have a lot of schizoid. I mean, now a lot of it's healed, so it's not so obvious. But yes, it all shows up in the body. That's the beautiful thing, I think, about studying core energetics, is because you think you've got to always look in the field. No, it's in the body. And then that's the gateway, by being able to read the body in terms of where to work with the blocks in the person. Having said that, we have multiple traumas and wounds. So you can have somebody who maybe their dominant trauma and wound is schizoid, but maybe their secondary wounding was the oral, the abandonment. So they've got both of those going on. Or they could have masochism or psychopathy or rigidity. Those are the 5, okay? And those are not the pathological definitions. Those are based on bioenergetics and core energetics. But so for me, that's why I really love following the soul, because we're a blend of so many different things. You might be presenting some of the oral defense in you right now, but you might have had a very strong, rigid trauma and wounding. So how do you reconcile both of those and be present with the person? But you've got classic examples of both. We would always scout the room for student volunteers. Okay, who's got the classic body of schizoid? Who has the classic body of oral and masochism and psychopathy and rigid? And then have them stand up and we would read. And here's what you start to look for as a practitioner.
I really like this split between the energetic and the physical, and looking at, well, everything in the body is reflected in the field. The field contains all the information of the body. And then a natural question arises, which is, does it matter where a person focuses their work? Is there a restriction from any point of access if it's also interconnected? Or is there some kind of a progression or depth that happens going from physical to more and more subtle?
I would say your latter, what you just said. I do think there's a progression. Does it matter where you start? I don't think so. Well, let me say this. So, it's kind of interesting about how core energetics was formed. I give a very simple definition to my students, okay? If you just kind of start with the family tree of psychoanalysis, you have the father, right? Freud. And Freud had two well-known students. He had Carl Jung and he had Wilhelm Reich. Okay, Carl Jung started to look at the soul and archetypes, right? Wilhelm Reich started to look at the energy in the body, and he called it orgone energy, and was noticing where it was blocked in the body. Well, Wilhelm Reich had 2 students, Alexander Lowen and John Parakis, both psychiatrists. They studied with Wilhelm Reich, and then together, the 2 of them created bioenergetics, which was based on body, mind, and emotions. John Parakis meets Eva, who's an Austrian channel, who channeled all of the pathwork lectures, if you're familiar with pathwork, which is also a beautiful path of awakening through the spiritual lectures and psychodynamics. They fall in love, they get married. And John goes, well, where's the soul? And so he creates core energetics, which is kind of based on the fundamental. And I loved this about John, because he was fierce, he was fearless. In a lot of ways, he'd kind of go right for the jugular of the defense, but he was always seeing your core essence, going, hey man, this is the truth, and this is what's standing in the way. So he would work with the body. But he was also, he was able to perceive the field. He and Barbara did a lot of research up at Phoenicia. They measured thousands upon thousands of people's chakras with pendulums and kind of formulated, what's taught in the school about the field. So, yeah, I think you can start with the body with someone, and the emotions, obviously, and the belief systems we carry, because it's all there. And I do think that just through natural development, there is a progression, because it is in the field. And I always say, look, we can try and fool ourselves. The field never lies. The field will always tell you what's going on. So I do think that that's a benefit. as a practitioner in one's ability to work with someone. Does that answer your question, Keith?
Absolutely. I think I would lean towards the latter as well, in the sense that there is the intelligence component and the inclusivity, the increasing inclusivity of consciousness, self, the expansion as you go up, if you will, or you go out, really.
Which is actually in my work, I call it EP, I call it expanded perception. I don't particularly see it as a higher versus a lower, but I see it as we expand as multidimensional beings, that yes, our ability to perceive expands, including the ever more subtle.
We started this conversation, Laurie, speaking of awakening. We've moved into discussions about healing. Are healing and awakening one and the same? Is a person who is undertaking their healing process sort of by nature automatically working with the mechanics of awakening? What's your thoughts or perspective on this parallel?
I think they're one and the same. I think healing is awakening, and I think awakening is healing. And I tell my students, because, sometimes people struggle with, like, calling themselves a healer, and I get that. And I go, look, everybody's a healer. It's also a natural part of who we are. And you walking down the street and how you greet someone is a healing expression or not. We're all healing because we are energetic beings. We are spiritual beings. So yes, I think healing is awakening, and I think awakening is healing. And I remember my mom passed in 94, and my mom and I went to a lot of workshops together. She met Rosalind, she met Barbara, they both gave her healings. And after she died, I remember my younger brother saying, Mom just outgrew her body. So she was healing and awakening. We are all doing that when we set ourselves. So I talk about the first two phases of consciousness as sleepwalking and denial. So we're in forgetting. And in sleepwalking, you're just really kind of reacting to life. Life is on the surface. When you cross that threshold and you take the journey into remembering the truth of who you are, that's part of the awakening, and that's the healing.
How does somebody find their divine purpose in life?
Take risks. Ask. I love Neil Donald Walsh's, and I met him back in the 80s, when he wrote, life begins at the end of your comfort zone. That's why I teach risk, passion, purpose, pursuit. You find your divine purpose by taking the risks. People thought I was crazy when I quit my job in my 20s. I had like a 401k. I had kind of, things. And I was like, you know what? I had to leave. I had to take a risk. And it was one of the best decisions I ever made. So whether you're actually walking out the door and walking through deserts, or you're just walking out of a belief system within yourself, that's a risk. But the other thing that's key, I think, to finding our divine purpose is developing a deep inner reflective life. I always say each day is a life. Each day is a life. As you go through your life, gee, where did I miss the other? Where did I miss myself today? Where was I really deeply in contact and open? And we learn. That's when I teach about what I call the living practice. I say they have these components. I kind of like bringing things down into simplistic terms that are tangible for us as humans. So I say, look, we're co-creating every moment of our life. And a lot of it we're doing unconsciously. When you start to heal and awaken, you become a conscious co-creator of your life. So I call it creating, experiencing, because we get to experience. That's part of being in the third dimension. We get to experience our creations, whether it's a meal, a breath, a job, making the bed, painting. We're creating our lives. So we create, experience. Then I say it's important to pause, okay, and inquire, to use self-inquiry as a way to develop that deep inner reflective life. And then out of that, transformation happens. Transformation isn't something we do. Transformation is a result. It's a natural occurring result by becoming alert and introspective and engaging.
We like to check in with our guests towards the end and ask them, I mean, you've obviously achieved a great deal in your life, career thus far. I'd love to ask you if there's any stones unturned, any intentions for the future.
Oh, wow. Oh, yes. Lots of intentions. So I'm turning 70 in May. And it's interesting. I'm very excited about this next decade. And, I was talking to someone about this yesterday. I said, it's interesting when you're young and it's like there's all this angst and you've got this perfect body. And then you age, and hopefully, if you're growing, you don't have the perfect body, but you kind of have this perfect spirit. The angst is gone. So I wake up, I'm happy. I feel whole. And another thing I've been teaching a lot about is like, how do we become autonomous? I mean, we're all interrelated, but I say, and I'd read this somewhere this summer. I had said it in different ways, but I liked how somebody wrote it. And sorry, I can't remember where I read it, but autonomy is freedom from object relations. So we use object relations, we use the characterologies as part of the healing, but at some point, to become liberated, where we become pretty free of all that. So in terms of future intentions, yes, I have an intention to do a lot of long distance walking in the next 10 years. I walked the Camino de Santiago 11 years ago. And my older brother's walking the whole thing in May. I'm walking 12 days with him because I'm teaching in England over my 70th birthday with him. And so I have lots of trips planned to do walking. I love my life in this body. I'm grateful for it. And to continue to teach and to write. I've got a lot of writing. I'm working on a spiritual novel, another novel, a book of poetry, this other nonfiction. So a lot of writing, and frankly, the intention to really deepen the deep knowing of how precious this all is. And as we co-inhabit this very sacred planet together, how can I contribute to that and to keep taking risks?
Continuing to follow your own soul.
Absolutely. Always.
Laurie, wanted to mention your website here, lauriekeene.com, where people, I assume, can find out more about you and opportunities to train or work alongside you with you. Is there anything else anywhere else you'd like to direct people to or to share?
Well, definitely to the Barbara Brennan School. I'm not super active on my website. I'm not very good at marketing myself. It's like I really love teaching and sharing. I do actually have, though, 3.5 hours of video of teaching that I've got to figure out where to put that at some point in time. But definitely, if they have an interest in buying my book, my first book, it's available on Amazon. And yeah, I would direct them to the Barbara Brennan School if they're interested in studying our modality, studying with me. That's where I teach.
Yeah, excellent. And I'm sure that those who have the chance to study with you are enjoying it immensely. You've shared so much with us today, but where we're at is the episode, and we just want to thank you so much for your time and for your wisdom.
Thank you. And I've completely enjoyed being here with the two of you. And I wish you great success also with your trainings and your soul's purpose being on this planet. It's a beautiful thing, isn't it, when you have it?
It is indeed. Yeah. Thank you so much, Laurie. Thank you for your time.
Yep, you're welcome. Take care.
Thanks for listening to the episode. What really supports the podcast is providing a rating and review of the show on your preferred listening platform. This helps us get the message out to a wider audience. If the topics we discussed today appeal to you, do take a moment to subscribe. Lastly, we invite you to check out our website, fielddynamicshealing.com, to learn about our training programs, private session work, and to see how we're setting the standard in contemporary energy healing. Many thanks, and see you next time.